Thank you. Mr. Gordon.
Two questions on the fee. This is a fee assessed by the state in addition to what other local building fees may exist in a city or county?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And I guess I'm a little curious, the proposals, I understand it, is to evaluate these fault zones over the next 6 years. The fee, however, as I read this at least, is proposed to be ongoing, the fee increase.
Yes.
Why is there not a proposal to reduce the fee back to its current level once this 6-year study has been completed?
Well, as I said, we have about 2,000 miles more of faulting, we believe, to be done, and we can handle most of that in the next 6 years. One of the issues that has come up, and lead agencies have been sort of requesting us to do this, is many of the 500 maps that have already been done are 20 or more years old, and they do need to be revised. Both there's new techniques for mapping, and what we like to do is reduce these zones as much as we can with new information, because they do sort of intrude on the building areas that lead agencies can have. Mm-hmm. So they have asked us to go back and look at all of these older ones and redo them based on new information that has come about, new studies, new aerial techniques, and so forth. And that's why the funding would go on. It would also allow for increase in just the cost of living that occurs.
Okay.
Any public comment? Yes. Welcome.
Hello. Excuse me. Sylvia Solis Shaw on behalf of the cities of Santa Monica, Los Angeles, and Beverly Hills. We'd like to thank Assemblymember Bloom and Senator Liu for advocating for this funding and for the governor for including it in his proposed budget. We strongly support this funding because we believe that the completion of these and updating of the maps is critical to ensure the public safety of our residents. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, the next bridge to cross on this is going to be, where's the money going to come from to do some of the work that follows from identification of these areas.
I'd move to approve as budgeted.
I'll second that. Let's vote.
Bloom?
Aye.
Campos? Gordon? Aye. Logue? Patterson? Aye. Items open.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Now we'll proceed with Department of Fish and Wildlife, where our first recommendation is to hold open. Get myself in order here. Welcome, Mr. Bonham.
Thank you, Chair.
It's good to see you back. Whenever you're ready.
Get organized quickly here. Just make sure I get everything in order. Great. Thank you, Chair, members, staff. My name is Chuck Bonham. I'm the Director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I think we have perhaps 5 issues in total to cover today for the department. But I first want to give you an update at your request about a topic we began discussing with you about a year ago, and then move into those particular agenda issues. So I've been on the job about 2.5 years. I am enjoying it more today than when I started. I care more about the department and its mission than ever. And I'll remind you that our department's mission is to manage this state's diverse fish, wildlife, and plants, and the habitat they depend upon for their ecological value, as well as their use and enjoyment by Californians. And I take that mission and translate it into one word for me as an individual, and that word is stewardship. And for me, stewardship is a duty, it's a conservation ethic, and it's about managing these natural resources so that we pass them to the next generation in a better shape. About a year ago, almost to the month, we began a discussion voluntarily with the legislative branch about a particular topic that relates to our department's management of agricultural leases and grazing permits on about 130,000 acres of our 1 million acres that we manage statewide. And I want to recount for you the activities we've implemented since I was here about a year ago. So those who are new to the topic in the audience or watching online, this is not new news, what I'm getting ready to say. It's a topic that we voluntarily disclosed and spoke with each of you through a series of hearings about, and the request, as I understand it, is just to give you the progress report on actions we've implemented internally.
Precisely. Thank you.
So in March, actually March 7th of 2013, the department I came over to the legislature and briefed leadership in both parties and in all of the relevant committees about some of our business practices around leasing and grazing permits. That disclosure in March of 2013 came after an intensive internal kind of due diligence period over the holidays, 2012, 2013, where we took a look at our business practices in this arena. And I came forward voluntarily. I think that was the right thing to do. It's what I believe is required by public servants. When you find an issue, disclose it and propose how to fix it. So here's what we've done from about that moment to date in a quick summary. We began a dialogue with resource conservation districts around the state who have helped us manage leasing and grazing on our properties. We immediately ceased all of the practices that might have related to how we were managing the revenue and proceeds from the leases and permits. I immediately issued a departmental bulletin I'll call number 1 on this topic, in spring of 2013, shutting down the business practices that our operations had been utilizing. We referred any and all elements we discovered internally or at the request of outside entities. We referred cases upon request by the Fair Practice FPPC, the Attorney General's Office. We took a whole segment of leases and permits which had kind of questionable provisions, and we moved them out of a so-called red category over the course of 2013 into a so-called green category. We unwound them and then wound them back up in a lawful manner. We shifted our relationship with our resource conservation districts from them serving as managers of revenues off books to them designing a scope of work for legitimate services and then putting a valuation on those services and then entering into a contractual relationship for performance of services. So we changed the entire relationship with our RCDs. We created a new template for our agricultural leases as well as a new standardized template for our grazing permits. We went to the Department of General Services and sought advice and approval of those new templates, which has been done. We created a standardized transmittal and internal checklist process. I spent considerable time in the field discussing these topics with our lands program, and input they provided to me was, Chuck, please provide a standardized approach. So if you're in Modoc County or you're in San Bernardino County, you know how the department intends to manage these issues. We worked with the legislature, and the legislature approved and the governor enacted 2 statutory fixes. You'll recall that a fundamental problem over the years was that the revenue generated on our lands for leases and permits arguably was not available for the exact operations, maintenance, and restoration of the very lands where the grazing or the ag production was occurring. You helped statutory fix clarify that the revenue produced through leasing and permits is now available for restoration, maintenance, and operation of the very lands that are producing the profit, if you will. And secondly, you authorized an ongoing appropriation of $2.5 million, not new money, but appropriation authority. Our best professional judgment is that these leases and permits generate about $2.5 million annually. We now have a sustainable revenue structure to take the proceeds off the practices and then you can use them back on the lands for the very maintenance that was, at issue when we began the conversation. We published a second departmental bulletin in October 29th to be precise, which details our new standardized approach with all the appropriate attachments. We've taken both those bulletins I mentioned and updated our operations manual. We went to each of the RCDs that were holding funds off of our own books, and we worked with them through their boards to reimburse and send back to our department accounts the books that should have been held, the funds that should have been held on our books. And we've begun to take all of our relevant lands program staff through training on this new standardized approach. It was hard, but it was both worth it and the right thing to do. So in my judgment, we have fulfilled the commitments I made to you and your Senate colleagues almost 1 year ago on both the identification of the problem and the steps we would take to fix it.
Are there steps remaining to be completed in that process? Can you
I don't
describe those?
think that there are steps backward looking as much as additional steps ahead of us where we've shifted the leasing and the permitting to competitive bid, and we've processed about 7 agreements to date. We have about another 15 in the works, and we're at the finish line with our first re-envisioned scope of work contract with an RCD, I believe Humboldt County. So we still have to get all the RCDs through into a service performance contractual relationship.
So this is the process of unwinding, which is completed, but now you're winding them back up again, and you're in the midst of that.
The new approach, the new structure, and the more transparent commitment.
Good. Mr. Patterson has a question.
Have you gotten all your money back?
Yes.
Good question and a better answer. Mr. Gordon.
Yeah, I have since we have an opportunity with Mr. Bonham in front of us, I have a couple of questions in a different area that are not on the agenda but relate to the department, if I might. I just, if you can, I'm curious because of my interest in coastal salmonids. Can you give me any sense of the status of the Coho Help Act implementation, where we are with that, and have we got some projects moving forward, and kind of what's the status?
Yes, I can, and I'd be glad to. So, Assemblymember Gordon refers to, it's got a longer name, but we call it the Coho Help Act, and I think it was Assembly Bill 1961, but it might have been 1968, something in the 60s.
The 60s.
Yes, which I think was enacted 2 years ago. And the idea behind this bill was accelerate good projects, projects that we all know are good for natural resources, and break through the administrative or permitting backlog that it can occur even for well-intentioned good projects. So I believe to date we've received about 5 projects into this program, and these are projects that typically come from coastal communities and could often come from timber companies and relate to doing habitat restoration, woody debris, sediment control. They come in a way that require us to make a ministerial decision by the director that the application is complete, that all the required information has been submitted. If you assume the application passes that threshold, then my ministerial decision allows the project to move more rapidly through CEQA because it's a project for natural resources benefit. We've looked at all the projects. Some actually have come through without kind of complete packages, and that's a lesson learned for us. We've got, I think, 2 qualifying projects where one went very smoothly and the labor costs were in line with kind of the expectations, and one where we've seen an additional need for kind of engineering detail. That's also a lesson learned for us in the program. To the extent we're contemplating this very surgical program becoming more applicable regionally, I think a couple of lessons we now know are putting a premium on like pre-submission dialogue with the application so we can get the package well scoped as it's coming in the door. And secondly, thinking through how we can have adequate staffing capacity to really move the application. One of our worries is the applicants, like the department, want to rapidly perfect restoration projects, and our inability to act promptly will produce frustration in the very sector we're trying to persuade to present projects to us. So we're very focused on ensuring we have the engineering capacity, because a lot of these projects do involve engineering design around riverbed management. So I think it's going well. We haven't received as many proposals as I had hoped. I think in part that's working out the kinks, and working them out in collaboration, I believe, will persuade more to submit. And the premise of the idea, I think, is an exciting one, potentially applicable more regionally.
Thank you. I'm very interested in what we can do to streamline permit process for these types of projects to improve our watershed. So appreciate the update and the information.
Yeah, me too. On a personal note, I may be one of the few directors of this department who, prior to being director, was actually an applicant for permitting of the very department I'm now director. So I have empathy for the idea of trying to streamline permitting processes.
Thank you. Mr. Bonham, maybe this is a good moment for me to just interject a question about the quagga mussel issue. I've had some inquiries, and you may not be prepared to answer that today, but if you do have some background, that would be great. And if I could ask you to perhaps set aside some time in the next few weeks to meet with members who might be concerned about that issue, that would be great.
Great. So let me start with your last point and say I personally and the department are available to sit with you or any member who has an interest in discussing the topic. I
assume that's not restricted to these little mussels.
No. My expectation would be that some of the Southern California members may have a more immediate interest in the topic because of our recent discovery of a quagga infestation in Lake Piru. And we're very available for that conversation. We care deeply about limiting the spread of this invasive species. It produces all kinds of problems, both for native species as well as water supply operational infrastructure. And it is also a conversation that requires careful discussion because it involves not only us but Department of Boating and Safe Waterway and all those items. So we look forward to that conversation, and at your request, we'd be glad to participate.
Great. I know my Chief of Staff is listening in to our meeting, so I'm going to ask him to coordinate that meeting. I know Assemblymember Williams is particularly interested, and myself as well.
Glad to.
Why don't we move into issue number 1 now?
Great. So issue number 1 relates to the department's proposal, which is within the proposed budget, to receive $30 million from the cap-and-trade revenue for habitat wetland restoration from our headwaters to our estuaries across Mountain Meadows, in the Delta, and in our estuarine habitats to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to achieve many co-benefits. We walk quickly through the proposal and calibrate my remarks to the 8 or 9 questions that appear in the staff comments and today's agenda. Of the $30 million, we anticipate a vast majority, about $25.8 million, being available for local assistance through a competitive grant program, which means no overhead taken by our department, and a much smaller amount, about $4 million, available for our internal operations relevant to this program. I think the first thing I would note for you is that, in my judgment, the facts and the scientific record are very clear. These types of projects do reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We know that. If you look at the scientific literature, it's pretty robust on that. In fact, wetlands are among the most effective sequesters of atmospheric carbon. And in fact, if you take a look at estuarine habitats, they're among the most productive and efficient habitat types for sequestering atmospheric carbon because they have high photosynthesis and low decomposition rates. Now, any given actual benefit will relate to the actual project you may implement on the ground because it's a combination of variables between sites and wetland types relating to soil types, water conditions, salinity conditions of the water, ambient air temperatures. But the scientific literature is clear. Wetland and habitat restoration produces greenhouse gas emission reductions. The next thing I would note is that our department is currently working with the Air Resources Board, as you probably know. They have proposed funding in their budget for staff to assist all agencies in preparing consistent methodologies for metrics and monitoring of implementation. And I expect a comprehensive approach will emerge across all cap-and-trade proposals. We are very experienced in running competitive grant programs. We've been running a fisheries restoration grant program since 1981. In the past 5 years, that program has allowed us to push 265 grants out into local communities and has put about $80 million of value on the ground doing habitat restoration. We know how to design a competitive grant program that includes criteria and metrics in it. Our expectation is that conservancies would be able to compete for these funds. Funds would be available for conservancies for this work in the field. I'm confident that we can design that competitive grant-making program and move money for construction out in the field in 2015 and 2016. Now, as I mentioned earlier, actual greenhouse gas reduction benefits are going to depend on the variables of the individual project you would implement. But as a general matter, I would predict, based on reviewing the literature, once you do a wetland project, you will begin to see greenhouse gas reduction benefits in a year or two. Here's why. We're talking about restoring degraded landscapes. So your baseline is a degraded landscape, and the fact that you're restoring it enables you to see benefits quickly after you've completed the project. I also expect that we would continue to capture and see such benefits out 20, 30, 40 years. And in fact, our department for 75 or so years has been managed wetlands around the Central Valley, and we have experience in this field already. How do you take a degraded wetland and restore it? And I'll end by saying one of the things that excites me most personally, and I think has our department so energized about this potential program, is the long list of co-benefits that come from wetland habitat restoration tethered to the primary benefit of greenhouse gas reductions. Here's what I mean. This $30 million, as we envision it, tracks very closely the California Water Action Plan, which the Secretary spoke about. In fact, if you go to pages 9 through 12, you'll see that habitat and wetland restoration, whether it's in Sierra Mountain Meadows or in our coastal estuaries is also a beneficial action for water supply, water quality. And it tracks Action 4 in pages 9 through 12 in the Water Action Plan. We also know that a competitive grant program for habitat restoration can create a restoration economy. You can actually generate jobs through habitat restoration. That's a co-benefit. We also know that the idea of restoring wetland habitat is an adaptation strategy for species. It allows us to reconnect habitat. It allows us to provide better refugia for cold water fish, all of which are adaptation strategies that show up in the state's updated California Climate Adaptation Strategy. We know that if you restore wetlands correctly, you can actually get flood control benefits as a secondary benefit to the restoration. We know that habitat restoration can help us better manage land subsidence in certain areas. We know that habitat and wetland restoration can support recreational and agricultural uses. And we know, particularly in our coastal areas, that wetland restoration is a great way to create climate change resiliency, sea level rise buffers, and ensure we have an insurance policy against extreme weather events. So our primary focus is on greenhouse gas reduction benefits, which we think the scientific literature proves is achievable through habitat restoration, but there's a long list of secondary benefits.
Thank you. Mr. Patterson.
Okay. Here we go again. We are taking huge amounts of money from large emitters, and we are spending them, it seems to me, on not on the greenhouse gas reductions of the large emitters, but in at least what appears, we dink around the edges on these kinds of matters with funding like this. So let me just ask you to help me understand. See, to me, you already have degraded wetlands. Even at a degraded circumstance, are they not doing the positive things? So what I'm trying to get to is, there's got to be, spending $30 million, there's got to be some kind of a significant, large-scale gained benefit to GHG over and above the baseline. And I'm just not convinced that there is a large room for large-scale significant GHG reduction with restoration. And question number one. Question number two, doesn't the restoration require water? And where are you going to get the water to do the restoration?
Thank you for the questions, Assembly Member. Let me start by acknowledging the way I read staff's recommendation is to keep this item open.
That's right.
Which to me means the conversation continues. The second thing I would add, at a broad level, as I understand it, the Air Board and the administration propose a portfolio of investments taken in totality designed to achieve substantial reduction benefits. And within that portfolio, which includes proposed investments in transportation and all sectors outside my area of expertise, is a modest investment in our area of expertise, which is how you get to this topic today. To answer your first question, we may need to agree to disagree. I think the scientific literature is clear that investment in wetland and habitat restoration is a sound one with a strong nexus to benefits in reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And we would be glad to continue a conversation with you and your office around that literature and the studies and the reports we see on that topical matter. As for your second question, don't you need water? I think that's true in part, but not true in full. Now, there are many landscapes in the Sierra where streams are ephemeral. These are streams and watersheds and meadows at the top of the system where when you have the ability to repair a degraded meadow in partnership with local landowners or local agricultural communities, that meadow is better situated when rains come and the ephemeral streams are running. So it's not necessarily the case in some landscapes that you must add water in order to achieve a restored wetland. Down in the Delta, I think you're correct that wetland restoration is best done in conjunction with a water strategy for those restored properties. We know that, having done wetland restoration in the Delta and on many of our wildlife areas over the last 50 to 75 years. A component of this particular proposal is to improve our infrastructure efficiencies so that we can move water to ensure managed wetlands. We do that often with rice producers, with irrigation districts, so it's a very collaborative agricultural department-driven dialogue to ensure water is available at the right moments to apply to land for the wetlands. And out in the estuary landscapes, my experience has been that those estuary landscapes and wetland and habitat restoration is more like the Sierra situation I described. You don't necessarily need to add water to get the benefit. And it's a little bit different than the wetland work we do in the Central Valley. But we'd be glad to follow up with you on that particular question. And I thank you for asking it.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right. As you mentioned, the recommendation here, and I think I mentioned too, the recommendation here is to hold this item open, and so we will do that, and the conversation will continue, and we welcome that. Issue number 2 is the statewide oil pollution program. Another important issue. Please
Chair,
proceed on that.
If you might, I'd like to invite Mr. Tom Cullen, who's the administrator of our Office of Spill Prevention and Response, to join me. As he's coming up to orient you, what I'd like to do is just walk you through the department's structure around spill management, some of its history since 1991, the basic nuts and bolts of the proposal, and then pause for questions. So, in my judgment, and I confess up front, I have a really hard time, having grown up in the South, pronouncing the word oil, because it comes out a lot like oil. So just bear with me on that. It runs through the whole conversation for me, but I'm trying to get over it. So I also want to thank in advance our long-running collaboration with industry. We have been implementing for many years a program on the marine side. It's done in close collaboration with the oil industry, and we're thankful for that collaboration. So this proposal today, in my judgment, is a long-term sustainable solution that will benefit all Californians. Here's why. It's a proposal about a comprehensive statewide spill program. It's not about a myopic endeavor on any one spill risk, and it's not limited. Rather, it's about a statewide comprehensive program. That's important. Here's the history. So you may know within the Department of Fish and Wildlife, we have our Office of Spill Prevention and Response. It's a standalone unit. I think it was created in 1991. It has its own, if you will, organic statutory authorities. It has its own administrator, Mr. Tom Cullen. It's got its own orientation from that organic statutory set of authorities. Generally speaking, we call it OSPR, but I'll call it our office. This office has statutory responsibility for protecting our state's natural resources from spills and pollutants in state waters. That's kind of its mission. But historically, its statutory funding framework has been focused on marine. That's an important element to draw out today. Now, despite that state funding structure around marine terminals and oil coming in by way of ocean, state law designates the office as the incident commander for all spills, whether they're inland or marine. So what we've seen over time is an office whose programs have been built based on that funding commitment that's westward looking in the marine environment, about 160 positions, about 30 million a year, and far less ability to look eastward inland, arguably a larger territory, and best prepare for spill risk there. And that, therein, lies the problem. Okay? So over time, this office has principally been funded by something called the Oil Spill Prevention Administrative Fund. We collect a 6.5 cent per barrel revenue on marine oil coming in through marine terminals. Now that 6.5 cents, as you know, is already set to decrease to 5 cents by January 1, 2015, and we already have a structural deficit just around the 6.5 cents. Okay? At the same time, we manage with UC Davis something called the, here's the word problem, Oiled Wildlife Care Network. We have about 30 facilities around the state headed by UC Davis. This is a universally recognized program to deal with wildlife who are harmed by spills. That program is funded by our Oil Spill Response Trust Fund. Its historical funding structure has been to fund it off the interest from that fund. The interest is no longer sufficient to cover the costs. And lastly, we have this historical structure, but we also have a very modern shift going on. The market is shifting on how we transport oil and where California's sources of oil are coming from. They're moving away from coming into this state by way of ocean and marine terminals, and they're moving towards domestic distribution primarily by rail. And we know that our current kind of several million barrel a year coming in by rail component of distribution and delivery is rapidly going to shift, we think, by as early as 2016 to about 150 million barrels coming in eastward. Okay, so there you have our history, a market shift, and here's the actual nuts and bolts of the proposal in front of you. Our department and our office and the budget in front of you proposes to create a program to protect all of our waters across all of our state that are at risk from spill. Full stop. We propose to take the 6.5 cent fee I described, hold it constant, but apply it to all avenues in which oil is coming into the state rather than just through the marine lens. This would allow us to add about 38 new positions, create that comprehensive program. We also propose to fund the Oiled Wildlife Care Network and expand that program inland, which we think is a literal win-win for all Californians. We have a complicated oil distribution system in this state. This proposal is responsive to that complication, and it's comprehensive. We need to stop thinking only about our marine front and manage the risk of spill statewide, irrespective of geography, and more equitably as to the emerging risks. This is not about a jurisdictional grab by our office or our department. This is not about trying to interfere with preemption. You may hear some say this field is fully occupied by federal regulators. Having litigated in my past life preemption cases, I don't believe that will be the case. In fact, there's a body of law that's robust around federalism in environmental law. where each entity has an appropriate role in a broader scheme to regulate. Here's what our focus is about. It is not about the U.S. Department of Transportation's focus on rail safety. It is not about the California Public Utility Commission's agent status applying federal laws to ensure state interest on safety. It is not about the area of expertise for state fire marshals around pipeline safety. It is not about well production that's best managed by the Division of Oil, Gas, Geothermal Resources. It's only about spill and impact to natural resources. That's our area of expertise, and that's what this proposal is about.